Continuing our discussion of Shabbat, I'm going to get into the application for cooking today. There are a number of commands that come together in order to make this application, so it's going to get kind of complicated. First of all, don't do secular work. That's talking about the work. Obviously, we want to do as much work of cooking prior to Shabbat as we can. There is a command in Exodus 16 to do the Shabbat cooking on the day before. Then there is the command to not kindle a fire. So this has to do with your oven can't be turned on. And then we're supposed to make the day holy. What that means is that we're supposed to spend as much of the time of that day as we possibly can in activities with God rather than activities for ourselves, i.e. making a meal for ourselves. And then, of course, there's the precedence issue of life over Shabbat, which is going to negate some of these things. So we have to put all of these things together to make a proper application for Shabbat. The first issue is cooking versus preparing. Cooking is defined by the rabbis as something that alters the character of the food. And as such, they make a differentiation between cooking and keeping something hot and serving the food. And this line between those two, what is allowed and what is not allowed, is called bissel. And they make a whole bunch of laws in the Talmud concerning this. It gets very, very complicated. What we're going to do is we're going to approach it from Scripture and discuss some of the issues that are brought up that have really to do with Scripture. And then you're going to have to make your own line as to where one stops and one starts. Hot or cold? Somewhere in the scripture, maybe it's Revelation 3:15 through 16, it says that we should be hot or cold, but not lukewarm, otherwise it's going to spew it out of our mouth. Well, in Shabbat, we need to keep the food either hot or keep it cold in a refrigerator. If you let the temperature die down to lukewarm, you're going to start growing bacteria, which means that you're going to have a health problem. Okay. Okay, slow cooking. It is acceptable by the rabbis to put your food into a crock pot or into a pot with a slow fire on it and let the food cook automatically during Shabbat. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll do the major part of the cooking prior to Shabbat and then let it on a slow fire, and it will finish the cooking. In other words, it's undercooked when you're at the beginning of Shabbat, but by the time you eat it, it's going to be just right. And that takes some finesse, of course, and some experimentation. But basically what you're doing is you're doing the cooking prior and you're just keeping it hot afterwards as a part of the laying over, which is what is mentioned there in Exodus 16. Um, so slow cooking does your cooking on Shabbat. Is this a violation of Exodus 16? Well, I don't have a good answer for that. The rabbis say, no, it's not a violation because it's doing the cooking. You're not doing the cooking. The work that you did was started prior to Shabbat, was done prior to Shabbat, and then it cooked itself. That's probably okay in my book. It's not specified. We can't say from Scripture one way or the other. So I will leave that to your personal application. They have a traditional stew called cholent, which is cooked this way. You put your ingredients in a pot, and you put it on the stove on a slow fire and let it cook until lunchtime. And then it's ready to eat. They have a lot of recipes out on the web and in Jewish books for these kinds of meals. They do vegetarian cholent, and so that might be something that I might like to eat. The next question, can an oven be used like a crock pot? Well, to me, it's basically the same thing. You are heating it on a very slow fire. I don't see a difference. The rabbis say, no, you can't do that unless you have a blech. Let's talk about a blech. A blech is a piece of tin or copper that is placed either over the stove or made into a box that you can put into the oven. What this does is it separates the food from the fire. And I don't see anything in Scripture that says that if you separate it from the fire, that it's not really cooking. They have the idea that if you pour the food from the hot pot into a cold pot, that it's no longer cooking, which is true. It's no longer cooking, but in this particular case with the blech, that is hot. So I don't see that being exactly what they're talking about. Their other concern is the knobs. The blech will cover the knobs. Another way to cover the knobs is with foil. This is a fence that they encourage, and they say that it's very easy to inadvertently turn the knob on Shabbat or forget and turn the knob. And by putting the foil over it or the blech, then you don't have that temptation. It's probably a prudent thing to cover up the knobs for Shabbat. But as far as separating the fire from the pot, I don't see that in Scripture. So to me, cooking in the oven on a slow burn, just like a crock pot, would be exactly the same thing. Same with putting it in a pot on the stove. Blech is not really necessary because you started the fire prior and you are doing a slow cook, and it is automatically cooking just like a crock pot. So gefilte fish is another traditional food that's cooked on Shabbat. It can be cooked prior to Shabbat and then kept hot till the next meal. They also do salmon in the same way. Making salmon patties is an option. Salmon patties can be cooked and then refrigerated and then reheated. The rabbis also discuss the problem of enhancing the cooking process, and they say you cannot do this. In an oven, for example, if you open the oven and then close it back up, the closing is enhancing the process by keeping the heat in there. Same with taking the lid off of a pot and putting it back on. Same with stirring. All of these things are enhancing the cooking process and thus are forbidden as part of cooking. And I would agree with that. A crock pot or a large hot plate, we discussed that. The other issue is the difference between solids and liquids. The rabbis bring this up, that if you're cooking a solid, it's changing the character of it. But if you are heating a liquid, you're not changing the character of it, you're just changing its temperature. And so it's okay to heat a liquid. This becomes a problem when you're making tea because the tea is a solid. Okay, so now you're cooking a solid. So the option that they go with on this is they cook up a tea that is like 7 times stronger than normal, so that they have a little and put it in a thermos to keep it hot, and then you have a hot water appliance that keeps your water hot, and then you can take some water and some of this strong tea, mix them together, and now you have tea without cooking a solid. Okay, interesting thought. The rabbis also teach that heating a fully cooked food is okay. Now, you would have to have your oven or stove on in order to, already before Shabbat, in order to do this. If it's on a slow fire and you put a pot from the refrigerator onto the stove or in the oven, then it's reheating it, but because it's already cooked, you're not cooking on Shabbat, you're just getting it ready to serve. So it's part of serving. In practice, the meal on the 7th day was cooked mostly prior to Shabbat and then left on a slow fire. Today we can put it into a programmable cooker, or we can put it on a slow fire to cook automatically, as we discussed earlier. Cold food is another option on Shabbat. The rabbis teach that you have to have a warm meal on Shabbat. But we know that's not true because Moses fasted for 40 days. So that tells us that a warm meal is not required for Shabbat. And we talked about this earlier in Isaiah 58, where it associates fasting with Shabbat. So you can fast on Shabbat. The command is to make a Shabbat a delight. And if you are using fasting to get closer to God, and if that is a delight to you, then you are fulfilling this command of making Shabbat a delight with fasting. The same with a cold meal. If you are eating a cold meal and delighting in God, then you are certainly fulfilling this command. I like cold meals, so that's not a problem for me. If it was up to me, I'd do cold cuts every Shabbat or fasting. Um, but that gives you some options there. So this kind of gives an overview of the application of cooking. As you can see, it's going to require some discussion about personal application. What does everybody want to do for this? What do we want to supervise, and so forth. But there's a lot to it. Okay, so cooking on Shabbat. It's okay to reheat, but it's not okay to cook on Shabbat unless it's an automatic thing, etc., etc.